Hello, class. I hope you guys are doing well. I just want to take this time to, first of all, just say that I'm hoping that things are going well for each of you in your projects and your research and all your other classes. I know Andres is right now helping me set up the system so we can actually record, and it looks like we are recording successfully. So I'm going to go ahead and begin the process of talking about some of the key points that I wanted to make sure I talk to you about for the class. Last week, we were face to face and we were talking about some key issues that I think are really important for you to know. This is how you bring research ideas and issues into the light of factors and variables that are what we call them once you start becoming more formal in the process of researching. So of course, that the focus of last week, and I just gave you one example of quantitative research, hoping that that will help you to understand some of the concepts and ideas. In the example that I gave you on experimental design was meant to be an example that I think is very useful. It has a very interesting set of vocabulary and concepts that if you are able to grasp those concepts, then I think that quasi-experimental single case designs and other type of experimental and quantitative research can easily be adapted from there. So that's why I use that particular example. So today I am going to try to focus a little bit more on the issues that have to do with research in general, but at the same time providing you some examples and some information regarding the qualitative components. Why is that important? Because qualitative research is also a very useful form of research for us. It probably helps us better understand processes and what people are feeling and thinking than if we were just to do a survey. So sometimes some of us who do qualitative and quantitative, we kind of mixed up these two methods and bring them together interconnectively, and that's what we call mixed methods. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more as well. So the title of the PowerPoint for today's class is Conducting Educational Research in Bilingual Settings, partly because I want to make sure that we continue to focus on the bilingual issues. And hopefully that will be the case even as you plan your own research. So let me see if I can move the slides. I'm having some difficulty. Oh, here it goes. So the first slide, types of educational research. So as I wanted to make sure that I give you some further ideas about the type of research that we have in education. So first of all, you see the historical research, explanation of past events, right? So in that sort of research, you are looking at archival data usually, and you are actually going back and interviewing people and doing that sort of research where you are trying to get a historical account of people. And that also requires some triangulation between the documentation that you find and the interviews and responses to interview questions or any other sort of anecdotal data or qualitative data that you may find available for that purpose. So historical research is one piece of also qualitative research that can be applied to the work we do. For example, in bilingual education, in some cases, you want to be able to do historical research because you want to understand what is the history of bilingual education, what has happened, what laws have been implemented for bilingual education and against bilingual education, and what impact those laws have had. So that's an example of how this type of work sometimes can be done. Descriptive research, right? So description of present conditions to establish a profile. So in some cases you do a profile. Sometimes in some classes I've asked the students, for example, to think about, a particular community they want to do research with, and to actually begin by doing a profile of that community. Who are they? What do they believe? What do they think? What are their goals? What are their objectives as a community, right? So you create a profile of the community, or in some cases is the profile of an individual, right? Because you are looking at it from a qualitative lens in which you are interviewing individuals. So that could be a descriptive research. So correlational research is similar to what we talked about last week, which is more quantitative, because we are looking at degrees of association between two things. What happens when I do this, right? And what is the effect that this will have? Although the degree of associations don't necessarily mean that one is causing the other, so in order for us to really look at causation, then we have to be thinking about what we talked about last week, more experimental design, right, where we have more control. So it's important for us to think about that component. So correlational research, the research for is the search for the relation between variables. So in this case, we are looking at the relationship between variables and studying those variables and trying to understand those variables in a causal form. And like I said, quantitative research in the way of experimental studies will probably be the best way to address those issues. And so we go back to the next level, which is experimental research, then to discern the effect of a variable or a group of variables or factors, right, into a group of people or individuals. So that would be one example of that. And then case study research, in-depth studies of a particular student, classroom, or a school. So in some cases, teachers use this approach, and as I mentioned to you last time in class, sometimes this comes in the form of action research. So it's an action research in which teachers study the case of one student, why a student A or a student B, is struggling in reading or writing or in these other areas. What are some of the socio-historical as well as sociocultural and socio-linguistic factors that may be affecting the student? So it's more of an in-depth study of that particular case, right? That could include an individual or may include actually a group. And then in the qualitative area, you also find ethnographic research, which is very important. So ethnographic research is the description of events that occur within the life of a group of people. So people study ethnography and they do research in ethnography. That is basically, some of them do it more structured, some of them do it more socially, meaning studying societal aspects and components, while others study the structure of the society in itself, which is what some anthropologists refer as structuralism. So it's a very interesting way also to collect data and to work with communities by conducting ethnographic research. And I think later on, I'm gonna send you a paper on ethnographic research so you can see what is being done nowadays in ethnography and what would be a good example of ethnographic research, that is applicable to the issues of education. So, and then the evaluation research. Obviously, evaluation research focuses on aspects that have to do with program development and evaluation. So sometimes, you are hired by a district to be the person who does the research, or to be the person who's going to lead a team of people, to be the executive director of programs for the district, in which case you probably want to be able to have some knowledge and understanding about evaluation research, because you want to know exactly what it takes to develop the program and what will it take for the program to be evaluated and what will be a good example of an evaluation of the program, right? So those are the key components that we have to be thinking about in there as well. So that would be an example of that kind of work. Then we have also the next slide addresses the topic of what is research. So as I said before, and I mentioned in class last week, research is organized and systematic, right? It's a systematic inquiry that seeks to answer well-framed questions, meaning that we have to be very careful with the questions on how we ask those questions. That's why I think it's key for us to think about our questions, our research questions that we have for any study that we are proposing, because it's important for us to understand that if a question has a double meaning or we can find a second meaning to it, then it may not be the best question. We have to reframe it and well frame it. So then we are clear on what we are asking and what we hope to gather or to obtain, for that particular question. It is not only the answer you get, but the question you ask that determines the value of the study, meaning that if we don't ask very good questions, then our study has some flaws and challenges. And those challenges and flaws sometimes are going to be pointed out by other people when you are presenting your work. So you have to be thinking about the questions clearly and focus on those aspects. Like I said before in class, in some cases, we ask quantitative questions and we try to answer them with qualitative research, or vice versa. We ask qualitative questions about processes and we try to answer them with quantitative research. So even at that level, we have to be very careful, just trying to figure out what would be the best way to frame our questions. So just generally speaking, just to give you an example, there are types of research in education. So there is, as I mentioned before, qualitative research, quantitative research. There's mixed method research. And as I said before, like in my case, in most occasions, I like to use mixed methodology, meaning that research that focuses not only on quantitative methods, but also qualitative methods. And whether one method is in the foreground and the other one is in the background, it depends on the type of questions I'm trying to answer. If my questions are more quantitative, then my quantitative methodology will be in the foreground. In the background, I will have my qualitative methodology and my qualitative data to support whatever the findings are or the main findings are from the quantitative research, or vice versa, if I am more focused on qualitative research. So mixed methodology is actually very helpful for us, and it helps us to better understand some processes and some of the outcomes as well. So I think it's a good approach for us to be considering in future research. And as I mentioned before, I have mentioned quite a few times, action research is another type of research. And the reason because action research is separate from all the other types of research is because action research is not necessarily the type of research that only researchers do. As a matter of fact, action research started as a form of research being done by folks in the field. So it's more practitioners, the ones who are using this type of research, as in the case of classroom teachers. Trying to find out, I learned method A, and now I have been introduced to method B, which seems to create some innovation for my classroom when I do X, Y, and Z. So what happens if I use method B with one group of students who are low performing in my class? And so the teacher tries to find out and divides the students into groups, right, working together, but then he focuses or she focuses the efforts on that particular group of students who are not performing well to see if method B will actually be a better method for them. And then he or she begins to collect baseline data, begins to collect data as they go through the process, and data at the end. So that's an example of how a teacher will use that. And why would that be useful for a teacher? Because then later on, he or she may say, this is a good combination of strategies for me to use in the classroom, and therefore I'm going to use them. As in the case of newcomers, for example, in which cases teachers learn new strategies on how to work with newcomers and they try to implement them, but they also want to make sure that those strategies they learn are actually effective with their students. So it's a good way to work with the student population, but it's also a good way for practitioners to learn more about and to see and to feel comfortable and ensure that what the methods that they are using are actually good methods for their student population or whatever the population they are working with is. Here, I just want to give you examples of some basic designs that I think that I am hoping that, visually I can expose you more to some of those things and to help you see some of those aspects. For example, in the first graph on the top, you can see actually that, statistics and program evaluation components in data-driven decision-making. So meaning that in this case, the goal is to make decisions based on data. For what purpose? Probably for the purpose of formative evaluation components to continue to develop a program. So before even evaluating the program, you want to be able to collect data and to be able to see what the data is telling you in regards to the needs of the population you are working with. So that's an example of research that is focused on evaluation of programs or program development. The second example at the bottom is a more focus on, what will be a dissertation inquiry, in which it gets a little bit more complex, because obviously in your dissertation work, you will be asked not only to think about research issues, but also about statistical issues. What are the data-driven decision makings that you are making about why your study is important? What preliminary data have you collected, right? And so the same thing with qualitative components in the research and quantitative components. Like I said, a mixed methodology, right? Because sometimes you have three questions on your dissertation, and assuming that not all of them are going to be quantitative questions or that will require quantitative data, then it may be the case that one of your questions require some qualitative, data analysis or data gathering in this case. So that's what a doctoral inquiry is about, right? And why is doctoral inquiry so complex in comparison to a research that is a little bit less complex as evaluation or any other program? Probably because in some ways the challenge is placed on you to actually learn those skills and to develop those skills and to gain the knowledge necessary to do any type of research, basically. Obviously, you will always have a focus on your research, your main focus, but obviously at the same time, you don't want to be, a graduate from a doctoral program, and not know what qualitative research is about. Thinking about and to be getting some ideas. Here are some further examples on how to use theoretical models. So the theoretical models are very important for us to consider. Let me see if I can change this a little bit, the format, just to move this a little bit more. I think I'm gonna move Andres a little bit out so I can see the whole, there you go. Thank you, Andres. That's very helpful. Okay, so the theoretical models, right? It's not different from what I asked you to do for your assignment in class, for your paper, to begin to think about how your theory or your ideas actually flow. Do you see a direct causal relationship between one thing and the other? Like in the model A, gender, has a causal effect on income, or is it more like in B, indirect causal relation, meaning gender, field of training, occupation, and promotion opportunities affect income. So at the same time, it's not as simple as gender and income, but there are other variables that you think are mediators and that are also having an effect on the causal relation, or at least in your model, on your way of thinking. Now, if you look at the third option, C, is a more complex model, right? In which gender may affect field of training, which may affect occupation, or whether it is part-time or full-time work, and income level. Or gender may affect because you go and you consider issues of child care responsibilities, right? And then how that actually leads to part-time or full-time decisions. It may also lead to issues of income level. So those are examples to show that how sometimes you can go from a model that is similar to the one in example A to a model in example C that tends to be a little bit more complex. But what causes that complexity is you, because you are the one who are rationalizing and thinking about it. And each box represents an issue or a variable or factor that you think is important for you to consider. So that's always a good thing. But obviously, one word of caution in this is that as you think about more factors and variables and more boxes to put in there, then the more complex the model, and the less likely that you can actually test that model. So we have to be very careful with that. So that's why in some cases for doctoral committees, we ask the students to think about research questions, no more than 2 or 3 questions. Why? Because as much as we want you to learn, right, all this, the breadth and depth of the field of research, we also want you to learn to stay focused, because that's very important in our field. So that's an example of how we will be thinking, or we think about these issues in some ways. So here are some examples of practice. So I also wanted to give you some examples that are less abstract and not that they are necessarily the best practical examples in the field of education, but I think that they begin the process of showing us some things that we need to be thinking about. Um, and obviously this model, you already know it. I have talked about this model quite a bit in class. And so in this one, you see Bronfenbrenner's idea that in his model, the child is being affected or impacted directly or indirectly by different ecosystems, right? So all these systems, whether it is the macro, the exo, the meso, or the micro, right? They all play a role in child development, according to Bronfenbrenner. Now, remember what I just said, that some models have so much to cover that conceptually this model is very important, and it makes sense to most of us as educators to think about Bronfenbrenner's model as a model to follow. But is this the model that you want to put in your dissertation study? Is this the model that you want to propose and that you said you were going to test, in your own research? Probably not. Probably you will be looking at the child and home environment, child and community, child and neighborhood, child and parents, and you're gonna stay at the micro level or only at the meso level or the exosystem level or the macro level. But why? Because to test all these components and to test them in a way that you are able to control for all the different variables, it's almost an impossible task. So obviously, this is more of a theoretical model that helps us explain relationships, right? Or the relationship between all these components and how these factors affect one another. But in a study, most likely we wouldn't take them all as part of our study and research. But it's a very good model to use as an example of the multiplicity of components and factors, right, affecting children as they develop. Another example that I always give in class is just to think about from my own research. When I think about students in the school settings, in the school environments, in schools being places where in some cases, let's say Texas Educational Agency has identified a school as failing, right? It's not meaning that in a few years, unless they correct something, they will be closed. So how do we transform schools? How do we make them successful environments? So that's the key aspect that you see there in the middle. Well, my claim is that maybe this model is not well developed yet because I will add some more arrows in there in between those boxes. But just to give you an example, you need to engage students, meaning that students are not passive observants or recipients of knowledge, but instead they are engaged participants who also have something at stake. And what do they have at stake? Their future. It's their future. So engaging students is very important. Engaging families is also very important because at the end of the day, the schools, even though they don't realize it in some cases, the schools in the school districts, they actually work for the parents. And so because they were created so they can meet a need, in the communities. So parents are very important stakeholders, even though sometimes we don't see them that way, unfortunately. But so engaging parents is a very important component. Engaging teachers, meaning that nowadays we think in some cases and providing professional development for teachers, and everything is prescribed, and in some cases is cookie cutter models of training that we have for the teachers, meaning that in some cases teachers who have 10, 15 years in the field receive the same training at the beginning of the year together with all the new teachers and with everybody else who probably has 1 or 2 years in the field. So that's not a good model. We have to be thinking about how to engage our educators. And one key aspect is to differentiate professional development to begin with. So the differentiation of professional development is very important. And then engage in district and school principals. In this box, what we mean is leadership, right? So at the school level and at the district level. Why? Because At the district level, people are making decisions about money, decisions about programs, about how much resources to put into programs. At the school level, people are making decisions how to enact programs and how to implement them in the schools, in the classrooms, and how to make the school environment an environment that is open and conducive to participation by students, by parents, and by teachers. So as a matter of fact, the leadership box is a very important one. So when I think about my own research and think about how then we are going to transform schools, is by bringing those four pillars together and working together towards a common end, right? In this case, student success. Here are some examples that I just wanted to throw in here, so you can also be thinking about how in developmental psychology, which is a field, that's my field of research. I am a developmental psychologist by training. So in the field of developmental psychology, sometimes we're thinking about, processes, of developmental processes, and some of them are continuous processes, right? Like the example of the starfish, when people study those aspects, or the dragonfly is more of a developmental discontinuity process, meaning that you can see the changes even in the physiognomy of the physiology of the dragonfly, right? So it's very different. But one key aspect is that when we think about developmental aspects for children, they combine actually both. They have continuous developmental components and they have discontinuity as well, right? Because we see stages, but we also see continuity in some ways. So it's important for us to think about that there are stages that we need to keep in mind, such as Piaget's stages of cognitive development in children, right? Or Ericksonian, stages of development. But also considering that there are some components that are continuous, right? And children continue to grow. And as a matter of fact, those of us who teach courses in the area of developmental psychology through the lifespan, for example, we always talk about these issues, not only through childhood up to the age of 12, but as a matter of fact, even as people age. So it's important for us to be thinking about all of those components and how they work together. And I just wanted to give you that example in there so you can see how other people in other fields are actually also making sense of some of the theories and some of the issues that have to do with the logic of research and the design of research. Another example of how people are thinking about the logic of research and the way research can be done is shown in here, which is socially, excuse me, it went away. Here it is, social development, right? So the social development, some people see it, and some researchers see it as a two-sided. One is socialization and one is personality, meaning that social development is not only the personal development of each person or each individual, right? But it also has a social component. And the social component has to do with acquired standards, values, and knowledge of a society and integrate it into a larger society, a social community. So at the end of the day, what we want to be is part of a community, right? So it's important. But then there is also the personality component, development of unique patterns of feelings, thinking, and behavior, right? Differentiated as distinctive for each individual, right? Or individuals. So it's important for us to see that as people think about social development, they also see it as a two-sided. Now, it may be the case that other researchers say, well, it's not a two-sided component. There are also other components of social development that have to do with the macro system or the macro level that Bronfenbrenner talks about. So they may actually add a third dimension to this. So, but this is just an example of how you grow from what is being proposed as a model, as a theoretical model, and you can grow it into a bigger model because you are adding now a new dimension to it. So those are just examples for you to see and to begin to think about these issues as you think about your own research as well. So conducting qualitative research, then in general, I just want to move into that section and give you some ideas of that aspect. So when you think about quantitative research, very similar table to the one I showed you about qualitative, but here is more focused just on the qualitative research. So the process is, as you can see to the left, research process. identifying a research problem. So obviously we all start with the same thing, whether you are a quantitative or a qualitative researcher. You identify what is the issue, what is it that we want to study, right? A review on the literature. So you conduct a literature review because you don't want to propose something that has already been done or something that has been done to the point that, you know, there is too much research in that area. So you want to make sure that you find a gap, meaning what questions haven't been answered that you think are important for people to know about in your field, right? So that's an example of that type of research. Let me see if I can get back to this. There you go. So specifying the purpose. So what is the purpose of the research? What do we hope to accomplish with it? Selecting a research design and collecting data. So within the research designs, right, we have quite a few methods that we can use in qualitative research as well. Analyzing data and reporting results, interpreting the research, and disseminating and evaluating the research. So obviously, all those processes are part of the process, and they go stage by stage or step by step on how you will do this research. So when you think about, you know, what are some of the approaches then to use, there are 5 approaches that are mentioned in here. And I want to go to the next slide just to give you an idea on how those approaches break down and what are some of the things that we can do in those different approaches. So first of all, we have narrative research, exploring individual stories to describe the lives of people. So you are creating narratives and you are talking about the lives of people. For example, in the field of you know, Native American education, you find quite a bit of narrative research. And the reason is because in some cases we are talking about communities where the language is dying or the people are dying, meaning that the communities are getting smaller and a lot of the elders, you know, are passing away and are not able to pass their values and their traditions to the community. So sometimes doing narrative research and interviewing them and getting those, you know, thicker descriptions about their experiences and about their practices, it's a very important aspect. So as a matter of fact, that's a tool that many researchers working with Native Americans use quite a bit. So the next one is phenomenological research, exploring individual experiences to describe the essence of a phenomenon, right? So in this case, what happened, you know, to you as a newcomer, right? So newcomer is the phenomenon, and then you want to find out from people what their experiences were as newcomers in the school setting. So in some cases, that phenomenological research helps you to understand that the students are struggling. You know, for example, in one of the studies that we did that is phenomenological, we were interviewing the students and conducting focus groups with them to find out what were some of the challenges they had. You know, how were they facing those challenges, and what were some of the things that they were experiencing, you know, as they were going through the process, you know, of being newcomers in the school, in the school. So it's important for us to consider that and to see how that may play a role in the work we do. We found, for example, that the students would say, you know, that the experience that they had was not a positive one in some cases because they felt like they were just being heard, you know, around and told what to do, and nobody was providing them any explanation as to why, you know, they were going in a certain direction, why they were taking a certain class, why they were doing this. And in some cases, that takes away from the student experience of feeling that they have a little bit of control over the things that are happening in their lives. As you think of, if you think about, you know, especially high school students, they are at the age where they also want to have some locus of control. So it's important for us to consider those things. So definitely phenomenological research will be a good way to study issues that have to do with newcomers and immigrants and refugees and other groups of students like that. So then you also have grounded theory research. So in grounded theory research, it says exploring common experiences of individuals to develop a theory. So as the word says grounded, it kind of has to come from the ground. So basically researchers in qualitative research, they don't go in the field with a hypothesis, right? Instead of going with a hypothesis, you go with questions. But grounded theory, actually, when they use that strategy of grounded theory, the goal is to actually go into the field with those questions and to ask the questions and to begin to form ideas based on the responses to those questions. And as more responses are available and new ideas emerge, even the previous responses or concepts that you have developed may be revised in the process. So grounded theory is supposed to be a way for us to, a methodology that we can use to really begin the process of shaping some ideas and getting an understanding of why people behave in a certain way or think about this way or believe this or do this, right? Whatever it is that we are actually studying or working with them, in this case. The next one is case study research, exploring a system of individuals to describe a case, right? So as I said before, in case studies, you want to study either an individual or a group of individuals, and they are your case, right? Could be the case of the newcomer ELL students in third grade, right? In this case, I may want to choose students who are low performing. And so why? Because maybe I want to find out ways in which I am going to be able to support their advancement, right? Their development. And so in order to do that, I want to do some research and find out more about what to do. So the case study research in some cases can be also a method used by people who do more of the action research, right? Because action research, that, like I said before, is done by practitioners and they use different types of methods to conduct action research. So, but that would be an example of that. So exploring, the next one is ethnographic research. So this is obviously the classic qualitative research example. As you probably know, ethnographic research is the type of research that has been done across the world, basically, across different communities in the world. And, there are different ways of doing ethnographic research, depending on what theory and what theorists you focus your work with. Who are the people that you believe have the best way of explaining certain phenomena. And so those are the theories that you use. If you use theories like Malinowski, then you would probably be more in the structuralist, way of doing research, ethnographic research, meaning that he was more focused on studying the structures of the societies. So there are different ways of doing research, and some of them are more cultural, right? So when you look at Margaret Mead and others, in the United States in particular, who took more of a cultural approach to ethnographic research. But basically, this is the study of people, and there are ways in which you do specifically ethnographic research. And like I said, I will share with you later a paper that is focused on ethnographic research, because I think it will give you a good example of how ethnographic research is being done nowadays, right? Because we have the old examples, what is considered classical research in ethnography. When you look at Lee's work, in Australia, and the work of others in Africa. So it's a very interesting work that people have done in this field. But it is good also for us to know how it applies today, in the classroom, in the schools, in the communities, right? In the neighborhoods. So that type of research that is also ethnographic and that folks are actually doing, in the field. So this is an example. I just wanted to illustrate to you how sometimes you go from the general to the specific, even in this research. No different than the quantitative research in that sense, because you want to, pick your topic. What is it that you're researching? The same thing that I asked you to do in your paper, right? So your final paper, when you think about your final paper, consider this as something that you want to be able to keep in mind. What is the study about? Parental involvement. In the research problem, what problem needs to be addressed? On the representation of students of color in college. meaning that somehow we need to reach parents. At least this model is telling us that somehow we need to reach parents, because parents play a role in the post-secondary education of their kids, or the post-secondary values that their kids may have, about their education, their future education. So it's important. So how do we engage parents in that area, right? So that's a key question. So purpose of the research, what does the research intends to do? So the study, to study different parent roles in the pursuit of educational access for working class families of color. So this particular researcher is looking at it from this perspective. You may be looking at it from another perspective. You may say something like, I want to study the different parent roles given the parents' knowledge and understanding about college, meaning that you are more interested in college readiness components. So if that's the case, that's very applicable for you as a high school director of programs, or as a district director of programs, because it's very relevant to find out exactly what needs to be done. Or as a researcher who wants to inform folks at the district level on what works and what really needs to happen in order for the parents actually to be prepared, right? Prepare so they can be involved. Because sometimes we also talk about parental involvement, but we actually don't have ways to support parental involvement, which is actually something important. Meaning, support parental involvement, what we mean by is capacity building. How do we build the capacity of the parents? How do we help them so they can actually be part of that process that helps their kids succeed academically? So here's another example of the characteristics of qualitative research that I wanted to make sure you also understand and have some clarity about. So qualitative research includes inductive analysis of the data, in contrast with deductive analysis or deductive reasoning, right, that we find in quantitative. From the general observations in the setting to reaching conclusions based on the specific, on observations of the specific examples, right? So here's an example of inductive research. Gather data, a specific level of focus, look for the patterns, right? So analysis, and then develop the theory, general level of focus. So that's what a qualitative researcher does. So the qualitative researcher does not come with a hypothesis in mind. Hypothesis testing is done only in quantitative research. So we have to be thinking about that. And as so if we have a hypothesis in our study, but also we have a research question that has to do with processes, then we probably, going back to what I said earlier, we probably want to be thinking about doing our research as a mixed method, because we're gonna need both methodologies to answer the hypothesis question or the hypothesis, to confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis, and to answer the qualitative questions that we have placed in our study. So deductive research, so theorizes, hypothesis, right? General level of focus, analyze data, analysis, hypothesis supported or not supported, meaning like we find out whether the alternative hypothesis is true or whether we keep the null hypothesis, which are terminologies that I talked to you about last week as well. So let's see the next slide. So in general, then we can say that when you think about qualitative research, then there are certain questions that you need to be thinking about, and what kind of questions I can ask. So how do special education students experience the language learning process as they are being mainstream into regular classes? So this is a question of process. So this question will definitely be a qualitative question, in which we can actually seek qualitative data and qualitative information. So a qualitative methodology will be something that we want to apply to this type of question. So that, for example, the other question says, how do rural and urban schools experience state mandated policies regarding literacy? So what are the differences? Do we find that rural communities experience differently, in that it is more difficult for them to implement because maybe they have less resources, right? Because, for example, I remember one of my students working for one of the region centers, and she was telling me that she was going to areas where small towns where there was only one elementary, middle school, and one high school. And so the question was, how do we implement some of the programming we are being asked by the state when we don't seem to have enough resources to do it? nor enough people, nor enough teachers, nor enough space to apply that. So those are challenges that the educators are facing in the field. So this will be a process question as well, or a question of how do we work that? How do they see it? So that probably is going to require more in-depth, right, analysis than the one offered by quantitative research. So then the other question is, what social processes and perceptions surround teenage identity formation in an urban high school, and how do these processes affect uh, choices regarding language? So the choices regarding language and how that affects the teenagers, right? The what question is also a question that is more feasible for qualitative research analysis, and meaning that we collect qualitative data, use qualitative methods for this purpose. Why is staff turnover higher in high poverty districts? This why question is another example. So I just wanted to make sure you also have some examples of qualitative questions, so then you can see how then you can begin to frame your questions the best way possible for your own research and your own studies, which is very important. And here's an example of, uh, me collecting data when I was working in New Mexico with Native Americans. So, for example, in this case, what you see is data from an alternative high school. In the students actually created this collage, and in this collage, they are talking about assimilation processes of Native Americans from a kind of a socio-historical perspective. You see an Indian almost in the form of crucified, right? A crucifixion. And then, you also have the hypodermic needle coming into his heart, um, uh, symbolic, right? So when I talk to kids, these are high school students. When I talk to them, what does it mean for you, right? I interview the kids, and I think I still have the videos of the interviews asking kids this question. And then some of them were sharing with me that it meant for them that people have, that's why the title coercions of change, because in some ways the change that has happened in their communities hasn't necessarily been positive in some cases. And so they felt like, some of that change has been forced upon us, and that forceful change has not necessarily been for our good. So they are aware of that. So what's interesting about this is that this is a high school where the students who are there usually don't do very well in the regular high school, or at least at that time. And so it's interesting to see that, because they were already having some challenges, but in some ways you can see that the students have a very critical mind, and they are very good at really exploring issues in a kind of historical perspective. So it's interesting to see that the higher order thinking, right, processes are very good, because they are actually thinking about issues in a very complex level. And so it's interesting for me to see that, the experiences that they have had. And it made me wonder, even at that time when I was doing this research, whether the students were experiencing those, frictions with the normal or regular, school setting, due to the fact that they actually think about these issues in a different way than the way that we usually hope that the students would respond to questions, which sometimes is a little bit prescribed, right? So those are the things that I wonder, and so I'm just thinking that it's important for us to consider. Um, and I just wanted to bring that example to you so you can see how sometimes, even from a collage, even from a picture, from a drawing from students, from a qualitative perspective, uh, everything that you see in an environment, in a culture, has meaning. You go into a community and you enter the town and you look at a big boulder or rock that is there. The question is, what does it mean for this community? What does it mean for them? So in the context of the classroom, to find something like this is very important to ask the questions. So the qualitative researcher is always interested in finding out why. What does it mean for you? In trying to get as much understanding about the artifacts that are in the surrounding community. So it's an important aspect. And then I think that another key aspect that I want to make sure that you are thinking about that are essential for research design is for you to be thinking about and asking yourselves as the following questions. Those are more reflective questions for you to consider in your own research. Is the problem I am planning to study an important one? It's all subjective, right? Because in some ways you can say that what's important to you may not be important to me, or in some cases it will be important to you and also to me, right? Or may not be important to you, but to me it is important. But the key aspect on the importance, I think, always comes back to the literature, to the to the literature review. So when you do a literature review, that's where you find out the importance of what you're trying to do, because it tells you what others have said about it, whether it is a topic that people feel that this is extremely important for us to study, and also you find out what questions have already been answered. But we should never be afraid that our research, or maybe everybody already answered all the questions. I don't think so. I think that every time that you do a study, you respond and answer three questions through your study, whether it is your dissertation work or whether it is a study you're doing as a researcher. And at the end of the day, your three questions create five more questions or even more to other people, because there are always questions. There's always issues that come up, things that we weren't able to respond to because of the limitations of the study. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind. So is the is the problem I am planning to study an important one? Then do research, do your literature review and find out. Do I have a sensible theory that links the questions I plan to study? Going back to the same thing. Unless you do a literature review, you don't know what theories other people are using. You don't know how they are connecting them. So that's why that is important. So for example, in your assignment, it was very important for you to first get your theoretical framework, meaning who are the theories who are saying X about your type of work, right? And then secondly, creating a model, because that model helps us understand how you are thinking about the issues, which now we call them factors or variables, right? So then those issues can actually be examined under the light of research. So the next one is, what is the qualitative data telling me in regards to the phenomena under study? Like I said before, ground theory, right? I want to learn from the ground. So the qualitative researcher is not so interested in having hypotheses or having ideas that I already know what the problem is, but instead he or she is more interested in unfolding what the issues may be, right? Or what revisions do I need to make to my findings due to the emerging data results? Meaning that the qualitative researcher is always making revisions to his or her findings based on new evidence. And that's important, which is very different from us who do quantitative research in many cases, because once we run the analysis and we have checked everything, we have done all the screening, we have done everything that needs to be done, obviously you get your findings and you get your significant values and you get your effect size and everything in place, then you are pretty certain that what you found is actually what's there, right? With confidence. So it's a little bit different. Now, one other thing that I wanted to mention, just to make a parenthesis in here, some people talk about objectivity and subjectivity as being objectivity being exclusive to quantitative research and subjectivity being exclusive to qualitative research. And I just want to make sure that you also think through that and think about these issues as more flexible, because I think that there are some components about quantitative research that are obviously objective, but there are some components that aren't necessarily objective and they are subjective. For example, when you begin to develop a survey or a scale for study, well, is the object, you're being objective because you are using your own ideas and your own beliefs and values and understanding about what is important to study, you see. So that in itself is objective. It's not, is subjective and not objective. So we find that. So the same thing in qualitative research. You find objectivity in some areas and subjectivity in others. So just keep that in mind, and because sometimes people want to make it like it's one thing or the other, and I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Is the study feasible given my resources, time and money? So the other thing you got to be thinking about, like I said before, The feasibility of the study can also be, as I said before, in the complexity of the issues we're studying. So if you want to study the whole Bronfenbrenner model, most likely that's not feasible. It's not doable. So as I said before, but also there are other reasons that make things unfeasible. And in some cases, it may be resources. So resources in the form of time, meaning that sometimes you want to do a study for your dissertation that will actually takes the next 5 or 10 years for you to research it. So is that feasible? Probably not, because once you present your dissertation proposal, you have 1 year to complete your dissertation work. So it's important for us to be thinking in those lines. So time. The other one is money. So sometimes we want to do studies. I had students coming to me and saying, I want to do my own thing. I want to do my own study. I don't want to use anybody's data or work with anybody else. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. So do you have money to do your own study? Do you find a grant, or do you have resources that will pay for all the components of the study? So that's the question. And so sometimes the best thing to do is to connect your work with the work that is being done. Remember that in many cases, people in the field of education, in particular the professors in your department, in your programs, they actually accepted you because they think that you are a good match for the program, meaning that in some ways there is some research that you can do with them, with one of them or a few of them, and then from there your dissertation can come out, and so that's beneficial not only to you but also to them, because your study will be one of the studies that they can also be co-authors with you, and they can show that some of the things that you were doing were actually things that are going to help them progress their own work, respond to some questions in some ways that they probably didn't have time or weren't thinking about. Let me give you an example. When I did my dissertation work in SUNY, I know my advisor, he had been in the field of education for quite a bit. And so he was an experienced senior, professor. But he found some value on the issues of community involvement that I wanted to do, and nobody had done that before, to actually go to a Native American community and conduct randomized survey study of the community. And so it was a very interesting component for us to actually work on and to be able to do. And he found some value in that, and obviously there was value for me on that, not only at the personal level but also as a student. So it's an interesting way to think about. So the feasibility of the study is a very important aspect for you to consider and to be thinking about as you think about your own work. And I believe that this is actually the last slide. Yes, so this is the last slide. So I'm going to end my presentation with that. And then I will pass it to Andres so he can kind of uh, stop the process. And I'm gonna probably stop sharing. So thank you so much, and I look forward, guys, to see you next week in class. So I'll be sending you some notes about that. Take care.